Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll just wait another minute or so to see if we have some more. We had a few more registered, so we'll see if a few more join us. All right, I think we might get started and we can just continue to let people in as they turn up. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet on today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and respect their deep spiritual and cultural connection to country, including land, water and community. And I also pay my respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be meeting with us here today. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our World Frog Day webinar for March the 20th. Now I know it's the 18th, but that's about as close as we could get. So we're taking this as the lead in to World Frog Day. Now, the reason that World Frog Day was started was to raise awareness of the plight of threatened frogs and raise awareness of the importance of frogs and their roles in our ecosystems. So here to help us celebrate this auspicious day and celebrate our thin-skinned friends, we have wonderful experts here. We've got Steve Walker, who's from Green Adelaide and is Mr. FrogWatch SA. We have Rupert Mathwin, who is joining us from Flinders University and many other connections that he has. And Rupert is an ecologist who's doing some amazing things with the data that's been collected on frogs. And we have Emily Reynolds, who is from the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board and is part of the Wetlands team, who'll be telling us a bit about their work on frogs. And we have Olly Cirocco from Department of Environment and Water, who will be giving us a rundown on what the department's been up to and the projects he's been involved with. And I'm your host, if you don't know me, Sylvia Clark. I'm a Citizen Science and Community Engagement Project Officer with Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board. And I'd also like to introduce Gabby, who is also from our board and she's from our communications team. So she's going to be the muter in case any of you forget to keep yourself muted while the talks are going. She has the power to mute you. You can turn yourself off later on when we get to questions, but she can mute you again in the meantime if you get too rowdy. She'll also be letting people in the background. Yeah, so please keep yourself muted while everyone's talking, and you can keep your camera on while people are talking if you'd like, or keep it off. If you do keep it on, we just ask that you look interested the whole time. So these four speakers will cover all of the topics that I listed there for what World Frog Day is all about. And if not, we are all allowed to grill them at the end. We won't have questions after each person. We'll have a bit of a I'll make sure there's time at the end to have a bit of a panel question time so they can all join in with the answers. So there is a Q&A option, should be up the top of your team screen, where you can put questions in while you're going, or at the end we'll let people unmute and put their hand up either virtually or really with their hand to ask questions at the end. Just letting you know this is being recorded, because what we are going to do on the real World Frog Day in 2 days time is that we'll share this recording through our YouTube channel. So you guys attending tonight are kind of our studio audience. So if you don't want to be obviously in our audience, then I suggest keeping your camera off and maybe changing your name to an alias if you don't want people to know that you are here. But thank you for being our studio audience tonight. Any other housekeeping things? Hopefully you all know where your closest toilets and fire exits are, because I'm afraid I don't. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Steve Walker.
Thank you, Sylvia. I will open up my presentation. Okay, so I'm a coordinator of FrogWatch South Australia, and FrogWatch South Australia is a citizen science program which has been running for about 20 years. It's an extension of a program which has been running in South Australia since about 1990. So I've been involved for quite a long time listening to the recordings that people send in. The way that FrogWatch works at the moment is that we have a smartphone app, and we ask people to go out to their local waterway and make a recording of about 3 to 5 minutes of any frogs, if there are any frogs calling, and also put in some simple environment data. You can also record photographs and include those in there as well. That data then gets transmitted to the FrogWatch website, and anybody on the planet can visit the website and have a look at the data that's been sent in. So the data, you can export the raw data and manipulate that as you need, and this data is accessible or used by quite a lot of researchers within South Australia, and Rupert's going to talk a little bit about his experiences later on today. But the other cool thing is that you can play the recordings that people have submitted. So for example, if you click on the survey that I did recently, you could go in there, you could push the play button and listen to the recording that I made. You can see what I suggested was calling under the user published information. You can see what has been verified by an expert. In this case, I said that I thought that there were some Bibrans toadlets calling, and then when I verified it, I agreed with myself. So I was pretty happy with that, I got it right. You can also see the photograph that I took of this site and all that environment information that I put in there. So I've put in specification of what the habitat type was and what the weather was doing. There's also a little interactive Google map, so you can see exactly where that recording was made within South Australia. And people can use this data to have a look at how frogs are changing within their location. So if they adopt a site, they can record over time. And it's also really useful if you are a land manager or a water manager. You can use the information about the frog's presence or absence to see how well your management techniques are working. And hopefully the Murraylands team will tell us a little bit about their experiences with this as well. You may wonder, why on earth would anybody be interested in monitoring frogs? Well, there's a few really important reasons. One is that amphibians are among the most endangered group of animals on the planet, and currently around about 42% of all amphibian species are considered threatened with extinction. So it's really important that we find out exactly what's going on with these frogs so that we can help protect them. They're a major link between freshwater and terrestrial habitats and ecosystems. So they're really good at cycling the nutrients between the land and the water. So as you know, most species of frogs lay their eggs in water, and the tadpoles grow up in the water. They will be consuming plant material. They'll be a source of food for many of the aquatic predators, and they'll also be eaten by some of the land-based predators that will catch their prey from the water. Once they turn into a frog and move on to land, then they become a predator, eating insects and spiders and other little creepy crawlies. So they're a really important way of cycling nutrients throughout those different environments. They're also considered the canaries in the coal mine, so we use them as a way of indicating exactly how well the environment is going. Some of these frogs are incredibly sensitive to pollution and habitat loss, so if we notice that the frogs are disappearing, that's an indication to us that something isn't going quite right, and hopefully we can then do something about it. The other really cool thing about frogs is you can distinguish each species by its call. So by people sending in recordings, we can listen to it, we can identify exactly what species of frogs are calling, and then that gives us really good information about the frog populations at that site. And the other thing is, frogs are really cool. I think people love engaging with them. So once you get involved in doing citizen science through programs like FrogWatch, it's just great fun to get involved with. We do run 4 seasonal censuses each year, so that the first week of each of the seasons. So we've just had the autumn seasonal census just gone. The next one coming up will be winter, then spring, then summer. We are looking to see how the different frog species vary throughout time. And sometimes people say to us, why on earth would you be going out and doing surveys in autumn, especially this time or this year when it's really dry, there's hardly any water around and there's not much frog activity? For me, the cool thing about some of our frogs is they do things a little bit differently. So for example, these 4 species that I've highlighted here, Bibrans toadlet, southern toadlet, smooth frog, and the Everett Ranges toadlet. These are all frogs, or possibly not the last one, we're not 100% sure for that one, but the other 3 species they're terrestrial breeding frogs. So this means they actually lay their eggs on the ground. The tadpole develops inside the egg and grows to quite an advanced state about the time you'd expect it to grow its arms and legs, and then they stop and they just sit there in the egg and wait. And if everything goes well, when the rain does come and flood the area, then the tadpoles can hatch out, finish their development in the water. So they get a little bit of a head start on the other frog species, which are going to be waiting for the water to come and then lay their eggs. So this gives them an advantage in these drier times, that they can actually get quite a lot of their development done, so they're good to go as soon as there's rain. And this may give them a little bit of an advantage in dry times like this, because they've got most of their development done. The Everard Ranges toadlet, we don't yet have any information on its breeding techniques, but because it's in the same genus as Bibberand's toadlet and the southern toadlet, there's a very good chance that it breeds in exactly the same way as those others. If you look at the sort of habitat where you typically find these frogs, there's lots of grasses, leaf litter, sedges, no exposed bodies of water. So these frogs will actually hide in the moisture in those leaf litters and live about their life, just waiting till the conditions are right. And here's an example of a Bibberand's toadlet. This is a male, and you might be able to notice he's actually sitting on this little clump of eggs. These eggs were underneath a bit of bark, so when I turned over the bark, I saw the nest with the male hiding in there. And the males of these frogs actually stay with the eggs and they protect them. And if they start to dry out too much, they will actually urinate on the eggs to make them nice and wet and keep them going, hopefully until the rains come. Of course, the father can't stay with them forever, so if the dry condition do go on too long, then those eggs are going to dry up and the tadpoles will die. But hopefully he can stay around long enough to look after them. So what does the future hold if we do have these extended dry periods going on and on and on and on? For some species, they may be able to cope. For others, they're really going to suffer. So if you think about things like the burrowing frogs, they burrow underground. They spend a lot of time underground when it's hot and dry, and then when the rains come, they will come up to the surface. When there's rain and it's created these pools, then they'll be able to breed, get food, get a drink, and then go back underground again. So they can withstand these dry conditions reasonably well. The ground frogs that spend all their time in and around swamps, they are really going to suffer if these dry periods continue. So programs like FrogWatch, where we can keep collecting data over time, they will give us a really good idea of how the frogs are coping in South Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And now we'll hand over to Rupert. Rupert, you're on mute. You want to start again?
Hilarious. Good evening, everyone. I was just apologising because I don't have good lighting in my office for nighttime Zoom meetings. I promise you, if you can't see my face, you're not missing anything. Shout out first to the First Nations of the Murray-Darling Basin that we're chatting about today. My name's Rupert Mathwin and I work for Charles Sturt University, and I'm also an associate researcher with Flinders University. Now, scientists like to put things into groups. So frogs fall into a group of animals called amphibians. We all know what frogs look like. Amphibians, one of the other two groups are the salamanders. Now, they look a little bit like lizards, but it's probably better to describe them as frogs in the shape of lizards. Now, there are no salamanders that are native to Australia, but we do have axolotls in the pet trade, and there is also one species of salamander that's feral in Melbourne that escaped from the pet trade as well. And the last group are the Sicilians. Now, these are kind of frogs in the shape of worms or snakes, depending on how you like it. And they can grow up to about 1 metre long. We also don't have any Sicilians in Australia, so only frogs for us. But that's good because we love frogs. Broadly speaking, they're an incredibly successful group of animals. We've got about 8,000 species worldwide, and they live on every continent except for Antarctica. And this requires them to make a bunch of really incredible evolved adaptations. My favourite frog in Australia is the holy cross toad. And like a lot of burrowing frogs, he lives out in the desert, which shouldn't be possible. So he burrows down in these burrows that can be like 1 metre deep, makes a little cocoon around himself, and can spend literally years waiting for the next rain to arrive before he emerges again. Cool stuff. On the flip side of that is the Canadian wood frog. This guy, when the winter comes, can actually freeze as solid as an ice cube. And at the end of the thaw, when the snow goes away, the frogs also thaw out and they can hop off happily. Very cool stuff. Now, in Australia, we've got about 240 species of frog, but new species are being added every year. So, for example, in South Australia, we added 7 new species and 1 new subspecies just last year. That is to say, 5 of those they did the analysis on them, but they're soon to be described. Either way, new species added all the time. Now, this slide gets a bit depressing, so I've paired each depressing fact with a happy frog. So, as Steve mentioned, amphibians are the world's most endangered animals. The only group that is more endangered than amphibians are the cycads, those old plants. But frogs lead the way, amphibians lead the way by a long shot. Now, globally, 41%. Steve put up 42. I once submitted a manuscript, and in the draft form, it said 39% were threatened. And by the time it came time to publish, it was up to 41. So the numbers are hideous, and they're getting worse, and they're getting worse fast. But there's a turtle frog from Western Australia, which is really cute. Around 400 species have gone extinct since 1970. But those are only the species that we can confirm to be extinct. So the true estimate is probably closer to about 800 or 900 species have gone extinct since the 1970s. And all of the models predict that the pressures are just getting worse. Climate change is going to nail them. Urbanisation, freshwater use, they really are getting hit from every angle. And so the upshot is that many populations now need to be actively managed to save them from extinction. Now, one such program is the Weir Pool Manipulation Program. This is implemented by the Department of Environment and Water in South Australia. And as a scientist, I was asked to design the monitoring program for this study to monitor frogs. So the concept is, we know the Murray-Darling Basin is divided up by these locks. These are giant concrete walls that essentially split up the river into sections. Now, historically, there would be a set level that the river was kept at above the lock, above the weir. And that was pretty much how it was kept year round. But what they started implementing in 2023, they worked out that if they hold back the water above the weir and increase the level, they can kind of trick the landscape into thinking it's in a semi-flood. So, for example, above Lock 1, by increasing the river height by, I think, 20 centimetres, we can inundate this whole wetland here, or over here, which wouldn't otherwise receive water. So it's a way of wetting and drying, and hopefully it looks like a really good program to benefit frogs. So, like all good scientists, I went off and collected my data. I started with the government data, which spans about 20 years. It involves about 4,000 or 5,000 recordings. This was back in 23, so the numbers have probably climbed by now. And every government recorded frog recording is from the Murray River. Yep, there's a lot of frogs. It's recorded about 12 species, and the recordings from the government data are between September and December, and usually between 8 p.m. and midnight. And by the time I got all these data together, cleaned them up, snipped them around, I realised that I just couldn't do anything with it modelling wise. But when I included the citizen science data, I found that we get an extra 10 years of records. We go back in time, back to 1994, and that actually 87% of all of the recordings are sourced from citizen science data. 83% of all frogs that have been recorded calling come from citizen science data. These are massive numbers. And citizen scientists have recorded 26 species compared to 12. And this is mostly because citizen scientists are recording not just in the Murray, but they're going broadly over the state wherever they travel, which means they're hitting a lot more species than the government can. And as well as that, rather than being in these defined kind of months and time slots, the citizen science data is much more spread out across the year and across the day, which are all absolute dreams for a modeller. It's worth also noting that 18,000 of those recordings are from areas that there are no formal monitoring programs for by the government, meaning that we literally only know the majority of our state's frog data thanks to Steve and FrogWatch and the frog census, which is absolutely amazing. Now, there is one shortcoming of these data, and that is that only 3.1% of the recordings have no frogs calling. And I get that you're at a pond and there's no frogs calling. It's not your first instinct to pull out your phone and take a recording. But when we're trying to train a model to detect when a frog's calling and what influences that, you kind of need some examples of what's bad to highlight what's good. But overall, an amazing data set. So what I did was I combined the data together, and then for each of those recordings, I recorded the environmental conditions in that moment. So the rainfall, what time of the year it was, what time of day it was, a few other things. And then I also recorded what the habitat was like at the site. So what the soil was like at the site for a bunch of different stuff, and the elevation, few other things. And then I fed those into an occupancy model, a species occupancy model, which is very technical and I won't bore it with you today. But what it allowed me to do was to train the model and then use that to predict where the frogs would live within the landscape. So this particular reach, I think, is between locks 4 and 5. We can see where the densest areas are, which might have 5.5 or 6 species of frogs, and which areas are likely to have the least species of frogs at about 3. And so that meant that when we were selecting the specific call locations, we were able to select them to really pick what we wanted to highlight in the data, which was amazing. The other thing this model allowed me to do was to determine how many recordings I needed to take in order to detect these frogs. So I started off by working out a probability that if I did a FrogWatch, a frog spotter recording, that I would detect each of these species individually. And then I went with the least detectable species, the southern bell frog, this gorgeous frog down here. And I used that, so if I can detect the least detectable species, then the chances are I'm detecting the more common ones. And with that, I was able to test these little green chaps are audio moths. They're a little automated recording unit that I use a lot, and I can program those to take set recordings. And I got to see what it would look like if I took one 5-minute recording, which matched the FrogWatch data, each week for consecutive weeks, and what if I did it with 1, 2, or 3 recorders at each site. And what I found was that if I used 3 recorders at a site and set it for 12 consecutive weeks, then I could be 95% confident that I would have detected a southern bell frog if it was there. And so, yeah, it allowed me to select the best number of recorders, the best number of weeks to deploy for. One thing I noticed during training the was that it struggled to detect an effective time of day. Now, frogs tend to call more in the evenings and at night times and less during the heat of the day, but the model wasn't really detecting that, mostly because the majority of recordings were in the evenings. And as well, that 3.1% had no frogs. There was few recordings with no frogs. So based off that, I was able to, for the first 3 years of the program, take every second recording. Half of my recordings are from random times of day, so that we're really training all future modelling exercises with these data to be able to detect that effect. And then we'll work out what we're missing next and move on to that. And the bottom line is that none of this would have been possible without the FrogWatch data set. It is incredible. The take home from this is that frogs are threatened globally. They're getting worse, and there's a lot of these populations that we need to be managing to save them from extinction. Good science can guide these programs to achieve the best outcomes possible, but good science needs good data. And FrogWatch SA and the Frog Swatter phone app are incredible resources for South Australia, for conservationists, scientists, and land managers. So please, 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 if anyone on the call has not downloaded and signed up, please, please, I beseech you to join the ranks. And the take home, I would say, is every recording helps, even if it's in the middle of the day, even if there aren't any frog recordings. Every time you log an extra data point on the state's data, it's all contributing to this mass crowdsourced behemoth that we have. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'll talk to you at the end.
Thank you, Rupert. That was very interesting, very depressing. Lots of very cute frogs. Thank you. Okay, over to Emily from our Wetlands team.
All right. Hello again, everyone. Thank you, Sylvia. As was mentioned before, my name is Emily Reynolds, and I work with the Murraylands and Riverlands Landscape Board in their Wetlands team based in Berry. So our team in Berry works on wetlands from the Victorian border all the way down to Blanchetown. And then the Landscape Board also has a wetlands team based in Murray Bridge, and they cover Blanchetown all the way down to Goolwa. So between all of us, we cover a really large number of wetlands all along the river. Both of our wetlands teams monitor a whole bunch of different parameters regarding the health and diversity of our wetlands, and they include fish, birds, water quality, vegetation, and of course the one we're talking about today, which is frogs. So in addition to all of the parameters that we monitor, we also manage and provide advice on the water levels within the wetlands. So previously, before river regulation, the river system would have experienced more regular small-scale flooding events, meaning that our wetlands would have experienced much greater variation in their water levels. So they would have undergone regular periods of being fully dry and then periods where they would have been flooded. This more regular wetting and drying cycle has many benefits for the general health of the wetland, but also specifically for frogs, with newly inundated areas of vegetation providing important habitat and food resources. Delivering environmental water to a wetland can also trigger frog breeding events. So the sites that we now manage with environmental watering can be split into two different categories. The first is what we call pool-connected wetlands, and because of their close proximity to the river, they are now permanently full of water, and we manage those using regulating structures. The second type is our temporary wetlands, which, because they're further away from the river, they only receive water during floods or really high flow events. So we use diesel pumps to pump environmental water out from the river and into these temporary basins. Now, why is this so important? So in the Riverland, we have a really good population of the vulnerable southern bell frog persisting. and we now manage our water levels in many of our temporary wetlands to suit the requirements for this very special species. Between 2019 and 2021, the team undertook a research project around the breeding and recruitment of southern bell frogs across the region to determine how our management could best suit the needs of the species over their spring breeding period. 2 different watering regimes were tested. One delivered a full amount of water to the wetland all in one go, and another provided regular watering top-ups over the breeding period. The tadpole development and recruitment were measured with fike net and spotlighting surveys to determine tadpole presence and their progress through the developmental stages. The results of this project have been extremely beneficial to our long-term management of our wetlands, as the team was able to show that the targeted watering regime using regular top-ups produced a higher success rate in tadpole recruitment, with suitable habitat and food resources being maintained for a longer period of time. So our southern bell frogs have the longest metamorphosis process out of all the frogs that we get up in the Riverland. They take around 3 months to go from a tiny tadpole to a juvenile frog. The fike net surveys for the study were conducted over 3 rounds, approximately 4 weeks apart, to try and document the 3 major stages of development. So during the first round, the team expected to catch tadpoles sort of in the early stages of development as they were just starting out. The second round was aimed at catching bell frogs in various metamorph phases, with little front legs and back legs starting to stick out. And then the third round was when the team expected to catch juvenile frogs. So by implementing our new targeted regime and maintaining water in our key sites for the 3 months required for southern bell frogs to develop, we are also providing ample time for all our other frog species to complete their own shorter metamorphosis processes, creating great breeding opportunities for all of our frog species. So currently we are wrapping up our frog and tadpole monitoring for the season, and we've had some really great results this year, especially for southern bell frogs. During spring last year, we had a good period of unregulated flows that inundated some extra habitat in a bunch of wetlands, most notably above Renmark, and the unregulated flows allowed us to deliver environmental water to an area of Paringa paddock that had never been watered in this way before, which was really cool. We heard the southern bell frogs calling in the 10 to 50 range at the new Paringa environmental watering site, and another of our sites out in Murraylands, we recorded the most bell frogs that we've ever had out there, which was super cool. This year we were again able to implement our targeting water pumping regime at our key wetlands over summer, which also gave us really great bell frog results. The species was heard calling at several wetlands where it was not recorded at in the previous watering year. One of these sites was Whirlpool Corner, where we were pleasantly surprised to hear bell frogs calling. We then organised a tadpole survey a few weeks later, caught some bell frog tadpoles in several nets across the wetland, and now we've been able to organise a watering top-up for this site to ensure that the tadpoles have the habitat and resources to reach juvenile frog stage. So this graph is a comparison of southern bell frog calls heard in our audio recording surveys. And as Steve and Rupert mentioned about FrogSpotter, so we put all of our frog call data through FrogSpotter as well. So definitely recommend. So the data from this year, the 24-25 watering year, is shown in red, and the previous year is shown in green, which is 23-24. And we've got those abundances recorded on the left there, and they also match the ones that are used in the FrogSpotter app. And each of the wetlands have been labelled to show the type of watering that they received this season. So there's some temporary pump sites in there and some that are pool connected. So all of the sites listed were monitored in both water years, and you can clearly see that we've heard way more bell frogs in this watering year at nearly all of our sites than last year, which is really exciting. We had 5 different wetlands where bell frogs were not recorded last year, but they have been recorded this year, which is great. The only outlier here is the Overland Corner site, which is normally a key site for bell frogs for us, but unfortunately this year we haven't recorded any. We usually pump this site in early spring, but we had to delay the watering this year until closer to summer. And we think that that may have had an impact on numbers. They also refilled the Banrock Station wetland just across the river in early spring, and they've recorded really good bell frog numbers over there. So it's possible that they might have jumped across and taken the opportunity to breed a little bit earlier in the season. Either way, it's an interesting piece of data for us and something we'll definitely keep an eye on again next year. And the other good news is that this graph is only representative of southern bell frog calls, but we've also heard really high abundances of a bunch of other species during the season. So we had really high abundances of the spotted marsh frog, banjo frog, and Perrin's tree frogs. So all in all, it's been a really good froggy year for us. And I'll, answer any questions at the end.
If not, cute photos.
Thanks, Sylvia. I'll just share my screen. I hope I'm doing this right. Okay. So I'm going to chat with everyone a little bit about the frog outcomes that we've had at both Chowla floodplain, which is at the top of South Australia in the River Channel, and also the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth, which is all the way at the bottom. As Sylvia already said, I'm Olly. I'm calling in from the Riverland, which is the land of the First Nations of the Riverland and Murray and Mallee, and they are also the traditional owners of the Chowla floodplain. Down in the Coorong Lower Lakes and Murray Mouth area, that is the traditional land of the Ngarrindjeri Nation. And so I acknowledge both groups and pay my respects to elders past and present. Within the Department for Environment and Water, I work as a project officer in a team called the Living Murray, and we have specific funding to look after what has been considered icon sites, which are just wetlands and floodplains along the Murray-Darling Basin that are internationally significant. So they support a really diverse variety of different species that are really important to conserve. And at both sites, we do a whole bunch of monitoring of the wildlife, which includes frog population monitoring. So this is Chowla floodplain. We have 8 local native frog species, including the vulnerable southern bell frog. It's one of the last strongholds for the bell frog. And the arrows are pointing at the temporary wetlands that we delivered environmental water to in the last year. So Emily already explained about the different types of wetlands that we work with in wetland management. Those big, large lakes would have received water in natural flooding events, but we don't have them very often, so we'll deliver water to them. There are also some wetlands closer to the river that are more naturally and permanently connected. And this season, we heard really good frog results across the entire floodplain. The really good thing about delivering water for the environment to these wetlands is that we're able to make sure they're the right conditions for frog breeding. Specifically, we can exclude carp, and that allows for really clear water, which is great habitat for frogs. But before I discuss the results that we found this year, I just wanted to explain how we actually measure frog populations. So we look at the breeding calls, and then we also look at the reproductive effort by monitoring tadpoles. So for the breeding calls, one way is we go out to the wetlands in person and we do a call recording using Frog Spotter. We'll record for 5 minutes and we ID all of the frogs that we're calling and how many. And we upload that to the Frog Spotter database. We can also use what Rupert discussed, so the audio moths or the song meters, and set them to record 5 minutes every night, and we can do that for the entire season, which is really good because it means we don't have to be constantly out there every night doing it ourselves. And so those two methods are capturing the breeding efforts of frogs. How many are there, and which species are they, and are they ready to breed? They don't tell us much about the success of that breeding, and so that's why we'll pair it with the tadpole surveys. The picture on the far right is what we call a fyke net. We set them in the wetlands in the evening. Tadpoles will swim in, they can't swim out. In the morning, we will process all of the tadpoles. We ID the species, we measure them, and we let them go again. And that's really useful for letting us know the success of the breeding attempts. Emily also already touched on this, but it's really helpful when we're thinking about watering a wetland and then drying it again. If we're doing tadpole surveys and we're seeing young tadpoles that still have quite a while to go in their metamorphosis, then we can make sure that water levels don't start dropping before the tadpoles have finished their growth cycle, and make sure that they get into adulthood before the water starts drying. So at Chowla, we follow that same watering regime that Emily discussed. The Landscape Board trialled and discovered in 2019 to 2021. And yeah, by doing this, we can make sure we get the optimal habitat for frogs. Sorry, my cat really wants to be in the video. The photo on the bottom right is actually Emily's hand, and she's holding a bunch of macroinvertebrates. There's some shrimp in there, some diving beetles, some little worms, a whole bunch of creepy crawlies. And this was at a site that we had thousands and thousands of tadpoles and a really, really successful breeding season. And it's a really good indication of good quality habitat. The water was really clear. There was lots of vegetation, which is perfect habitat for frogs. And as a result, there was a lot of productivity. So frogs had a great year at Chowla. After quite a minimal breeding year the year before, we heard a full chorus at every site we recorded. So that means high numbers and a diverse number of species calling all the time. And 7 out of the possible 8 species were heard calling, which included one of the burrowing frog species. And we don't hear them calling every year. They don't breed every year. So that was really, really encouraging. And we also heard the vulnerable southern bell frog calling at every site that we monitored as well. And our tadpole surveys reflected this as well. The breeding attempts were very successful. We surveyed for tadpoles 3 different times over spring, and every time we were catching tadpoles in the hundreds across every site that we surveyed. And we also were able to confirm that the frogs we could hear calling that we thought were burrowing frogs were definitely burrowing frogs, because at one of the sites, the site with the macroinvertebrates that Emily is holding, we were catching lots of the burrowing frog tadpoles as well. And the southern bell frog had a great year too. That's in the right tadpole and adult. We were catching large numbers of tadpoles and adults, all at different ages, all throughout the season too. So moving down to the very bottom of the system, I wanted to talk about a project that has been underway around the lower lakes, where trying to see if there are southern bell frogs still present in this area. There have been historically. I would actually love if anyone in the question time, if anyone of our other presenters has knowledge about the last time they were recorded calling, that would be great, because the last record I could find was 2012. But I know that anecdotally people have said they've heard them calling more recently than that. I just couldn't find an actual data record of it. So if anyone has that, that would be amazing. But nevertheless, 2012 was a while ago. So we actually partnered with the Landscape Board, and they helped us to put out song meters at a bunch of sites where bell frogs have previously been heard in this area. On the left, there are some photos of, well, that's one of our sites and the type of fringing vegetation that we've been targeting. And we set them up to record across spring and summer 24-25. We're currently in the process of listening to all the data, so we haven't got through it all yet. But it would be really interesting to see what it shows, whether or not there are bell frogs as a first question, but also the water levels in the lower lakes during the sampling time dropped about halfway through the sampling time. And you can, on a quick listen to the data, you can hear the frogs start to move away from the recording units in line with that drawdown of water. And so it would be really interesting once we have the full data process to be able to compare to the lake levels dropping, because I think it will have a really big impact on what we've found. This is just to illustrate that point. So the photo on the left was when we went out and set the song meters up, and you can see the water is very much in that lovely fringing zone with lots of good vegetation and good habitat for frogs. And in February, the water has significantly receded. So this is not actually the lake itself, but it's a wetland that is connected to the lake. And all of that available habitat is now dry, which is not good for when you're thinking about maintaining the recruitment process of tadpoles and the growth of tadpoles. So once all that data is processed, we'll be able to see how much impact that's having. And that's everything. So questions at the end, I guess.
Thanks, Olly. Some very interesting stuff there, and you're looking forward to seeing what those results are. And yet, it is time for questions. It's that time we've been waiting for. Gary, did anyone put anything in the Q&A box? No. All right. Does anybody want to, in the audience, want to put their hand up virtually or turn their camera on and wave if you want to ask a live question? Wow.
While we're waiting,
People are thinking about it. Steve, if you want to, do you know the answer to Ollie's question?
I do. So
About the data?
we had recording from Wellington in 2020 of a southern bell frog, and then in 2021 there was one at Milang.
Thank you so much.
Recordings.
That's good, because we've got we put a song meter up in Wellington, actually several, so that's good.
Sorry, my speaker's just broken up there. That's a question. I've got some questions. So many questions. With the different photos, you said that they're reasonably well suited for drying out, but I'm assuming they get to a point where the area they place their eggs in will just get too dry for too long, and they'll run out of urine and point back through.
I couldn't hear what you said then. That was cutting out for me.
How dry
Yeah.
does the land have to be for the pseudophrenies to start running into troubles with their babies?
They can handle if there's a little bit of moisture in the dirt and in the leaf litter. If it gets super dry, then they're gonna really suffer. So if it's slightly damp, they'll be fine. If it gets completely dry, then they're in trouble. Yeah, so if you get a dry spell going on and on and on and on, that's really going to be a problem for them.
So Nikki Mitchell, who's now an academic in Perth, I think, did her honours a million years ago in the Adelaide Hills on biberons toadlets, and she put out little sprinklers and actually sprinkled over the area, and she was able to increase the amount of calling and the successful breeding events under these sprinklers. So in a climate change future, if those guys start running into trouble, then setting up arrays of sprinklers might actually be an option.
Oh. That was really similar to the question that I had. It was also about vibrance, and I was curious if, the sprinklers, or if the conditions are maintained damp enough to avoid desiccation of the eggs, how long can they lay there dormant and viable until rain comes?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that. I guess it's going to come down to how much water content is in the egg to start with. So they can handle a bit of drying on the outside as long as there's still some water content within the egg. But if they completely desiccate like a currant, then they're going to suffer. They can handle drying a little bit. And as I said, the father will try to keep them wet if he can. But if he can't get water, he can't keep weeing on them to keep them wet. He's going to go looking for water somewhere else, and then the eggs are on their own. So yeah, it can be a problem for them. So it's really interesting because they have got to make a value call, guessing what the future is going to be like. So they need to breed before the rains. So they're not like the other frogs who can go, well, it's not raining, I won't breed yet. They've got to go, I've got to breed and hope the rains do come. So yes, really tricky for them.
We have a question in the Q&A from Kylie, and it says, as climate change continues to accelerate, will translocation of species, in particular the southern bell frog, be an option?
So the IUCN, the International Organization for Conservation, they have a range of guidelines for how you should go about saving frogs, and they are really specific about saying it's an absolute last resort to translocate animals. But the reality is that there's some frogs, for example, if you live in a rain cloud on top of a mountain here and the next rain cloud is hundreds of k's away, that expecting them just to move naturally, it's just unrealistic. So I think if we're going to keep these frogs alive, we have to be willing to think outside the box sometimes.
We just have to take note of what other frogs might be in the area that we move frogs into. We don't want to impact on the local species.
Coming at the same time.
Oh, sorry, Sylvia, I'm having a really hard time hearing you. I'm not sure who that was directed at. I couldn't hear.
Is that any better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. yeah, this was about the tasty looking bell frog tadpoles. They look delicious. So when you get lots and lots of them, do you tend to get lots of water birds hanging around, like egrets and things, trying to eat them? Do you see that connection when you're out there?
Well, we conduct water bird surveys, not necessarily always at the exact same time as we're doing our frog surveys and tadpole surveys, but we'll do it when we're filling up a wetland and then also as it's drawing down. And at Chowla, at least, we get really, really large numbers of water birds in a variety of different categories when we're doing this, and a lot of that would definitely be down to the food. Yeah, frogs and tadpoles are excellent food resources. So we see a lot of bird numbers being supported. It's pretty safe to assume some of that is because of the frogs that we're growing and the other macroinvertebrates. Yeah, I've never seen a bird actually grab a frog whilst on site, but I'm sure it happens when we're not looking.
Yeah, I would say that if you have a buffet, things will come to feed, and that's one of the reasons frogs and other amphibians lay so many eggs. Most of them are not going to survive to adulthood, and a rule of thumb that you often hear is about 3 eggs will survive all the way to becoming a frog that then reproduces out of every 100 that are laid. So only expecting about a 3% survival rate, just because most of them are going to get eaten by predators.
Excellent. Does anyone else, we're down to our last couple of minutes, has anyone got any other questions? All right. Thank you, speakers. Thank you so much. I think you must have answered everybody's questions as you were talking. And thank you to our studio audience for being part of this. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot about frogs. I know I did. Yeah, so this will be recorded and shared on World Frog Day and will be available into the future as well. So tell all your friends about it, because I think it was really worth listening to. So thank you, everybody, and happy World Frog Day.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.